The Word of God tells us that in the beginning, God. The Bible also emphasizes that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So we're going to talk and look at what God has created. And the Bible tells us that God made a beautiful world. He took time for his creation. And at the end of the day, he stood back, looked at what he had done. God pronounced that it is beautiful. That is what God has left us, the beauty of his creation. If we go back into history, we would realize that for several centuries, maybe from the time of Adam and Eve until maybe the 17th and the 18th century, human beings lived at peace with nature. Men, women, they hunted, they tilled the land. There were no machines to do anything. And life was pleasant as far as God's creation was concerned. But with time, with development, with what we say civilization, we have so much exploited the resources of this earth, not sustainably, but unsustainably. In exploiting what God has given us, I would say that we have made a mess, a terrible mess, but not exploiting sustainably what God has done. As believers, we know that the Bible tells us that we are stewards of what God has created. God said, man, live on the land, till the land, eat of it, and make the best use of what I have created. And so we should be custodians of what God has made. We are his stewards to look after the beautiful earth that has been created. But as I said, we've made a mess. And we in Ghana can see the consequences of our actions. I will start by looking at climate change because it's the major issue now at the global level. If you're watching television and you've seen what is happening in Pakistan, the flooding, the areas, vast areas of the country, about 1/3 of Pakistan is covered with water. Whilst it is raining there, you go to Somalia, parts of Ethiopia, and they have drought. And they are talking about starvation of millions. Now, what is the cause of all this? I want to zero in on climate change. Why climate change? Why is it happening? Where is it originating from? Well, as I said, for several years, man lived in harmony with nature. And we didn't have much of a problem. But starting from about the 1820s, with the development of the steam engine and production of energy and machines for transportation, we began to use what we call fossil fuels. Maybe I'm taking you into some basics of climate change. We began using fossil fuel. The worst of them is coal. We don't use coal in Ghana, but those who are a bit older you will realize that our locomotive engines, those days were using coal. And so when the locomotive is going, kijigata, then they're pumping it, and then they are burning the coal, and that is what fired the locomotive engine. But in firing the engine, it was polluting the atmosphere, because coal is the most polluting of the fossil fuels that we have. And for many years, it was used for generating energy and the power that we need for industries, for our homes, and so on and so forth. And then came the exploitation of oil. Ghana has oil. Nigeria has oil. Gabon has oil. A number of countries in Africa also have oil. But with the burning of the oil, we are emitting what we call the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. What are greenhouse gases? The major one is carbon dioxide. And we get carbon dioxide from burning of fossil fuels, of coal, of oil. And the greenhouse gases also include nitrous oxide and methane and some other gases. And so these are emitted into the atmosphere, burning everywhere. Coal, wood. In fact, in some of our places here, it is wood and so on. So we emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. At some point, it was not that dangerous. But with industrial development and growth, the cars we drive, the trucks, the energy producing plants and so on, are all emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And it's happening all over the world. It's happening all over the world. And we did not notice it or realize that this was causing a problem for us. Until maybe just about 1988 or something, a group of scientists met together, and they had been measuring temperatures on the globe around, and they realized that temperatures were rising. It was getting slightly hotter. It wasn't that massive for us to have taken note of it. But the researchers, the meteo people who were measuring temperature, realized that there's a gradual rise in temperatures across the globe. And then they realized that this temperature rise was coming from the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. When you burn something, where does it go? It goes up to the atmosphere. And over time, the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere created a bit of a barrier between the earth and the sun. In the absence of the greenhouse gas accumulation, the sun hits the earth and goes back. I'm sorry, this is a bit scientific, but this is how it has been taught. And so the sun hits the earth and goes back. But then with the accumulation of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, when the sun's rays hit the earth and they are going up, they are blocked by the greenhouse gases. And that is how the warming has been created on planet Earth. And this is what is causing the crisis that we have, the accumulation of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And we continue to emit. On a daily basis, we are emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And this is how it is getting warmer and warmer. At the moment, in the climate change negotiations, they are saying that we ought to limit global temperature rise to not more than 1.5 degrees as it is at the moment. Let me also say that with the climate change and the warming that is taking place, Africa is the continent that is hit the most. Africa is most vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change. But Africa contributes very little. In fact, we contribute between 4 and 6% of global emissions of greenhouse gases because of our low level of development. But the developed countries, in fact, when we started the climate change negotiations way back in 1991, and Madame Joyce Ayu was here, and we worked at the Environmental Protection Council at that time, and looking at various environmental issues affecting the globe. But then, over time, this temperature rise is beginning to impact this planet. Africa, I said, we emit just about 4 to 6% at most. In 1991, when the climate change negotiations started, the United States of America was the world's largest emitter, emitting 25% of global emissions of greenhouse gases. China was not there yet. But with time, China has overtaken the United States. And we know the level of industrialization. Everything you buy, even in Europe and America, you look at the back and it says made in China. So China has now taken over as the world's largest emitter. So between the United States and China, they contribute about 50% of global emissions of greenhouse gases, which is causing the havoc that currently we have now. So what are the impacts of climate change? It's affecting the weather pattern. And what is happening across the globe is that either you get too much of something, too much of water, too much of heat. As a matter of fact, I was in UK about a month ago, and UK was hotter than Ghana. It's unexpected. But this is what is happening across the globe. And it's not good. You may say that, oh, it gets warmer. And there are adverse consequences of warming. You know, if the temperature rise goes all the way up to the Arctic and Antarctic circles, what happens? The ice caps and the glaciers begin to melt. And when they melt, the water that is melted as a result of the heat to the ice gets into the sea, and we get something called sea level rise. And sea level rise causes the erosion in Qatar. And for some of the small island states in the Pacific and the Atlantic, their very existence as countries is at complete risk. Not because of anything they have done, but as a result of the melting of the ice caps from your geography lessons in the Arctic in the north and the Antarctic in the south, melting, and therefore, or thereby, leading to sea level rise. And we are told that should it continue at the current rate, some of the islands that we know in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, may cease to exist. And this is not fantasy. Some years back, Maldives, it consists of a group of islands. I think about 3,000 islands, some dotted in the sea. I was there some years back, and the hotel where I stayed, it was for a conference. That hotel alone was on one island by itself. And so if you want to visit another island, you can only go by boat. And the airport itself is on another island. Separate. The airport occupies one island. And somehow they had sea level rise, and that island was flooded. No plane could land. No plane could take off. So when we talk about sea level rise, when we talk about climate change, this is how dire it has become for some of the small islands, and they could vanish. But we also feel it. We are feeling the impact in Ghana, the erosion that is taking place. And you see, when governments have to address events like this, the erosion on our coasts, it means that money that should be used for development in other areas has to be used to build sea defense walls. And these are all consequences of climate change. So that is how it affects us. Instead of using money for development in other areas, we use it addressing the impacts, the adverse effects of climate change. So please bear this in mind, that climate change is serious. It is not a fiction. It is happening. When the weather changes, climate change affects rainfall patterns. So you expect the rains to come when? Maybe starting from April onwards. The farmers get ready their land in March. They clear the land, waiting for the rains to come. And the rains don't come. They come late. And by that time, a little bit of rain would have fallen on the earth, and the maize begins to grow. And we are happy we're going to have a good harvest. And then the weather changes and the rains do not come. And so the maize shrivels. And what happens? Government has to find money. We have to eat. So instead of the money they were going to use for something else, they have to import grain so that we can eat. So climate change is serious. It's a serious thing, and I've been involved in the negotiations for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, of the Kyoto Protocol, and currently the Paris Agreement. But in a negotiation of an international nature, every country is looking for its own. They know the impacts on us, the developing countries. We have got two classes, main classes of countries in the negotiations: the developed and the developing countries. The developing countries, we are suffering. It is not our fault, too. We didn't cause it, because the developed countries, as a result of their development patterns, emit much more than we do. 4-6%, it doesn't do any harm. But those emitting 15, Europe, Japan, Canada, Australia, Russia, and a number of them are responsible. China, they are all responsible for us. So in the international negotiations, we try to see what could be done. But the developed countries don't want to reduce their lifestyle. They want to go living comfortably. And so they continue to emit. Whatever you do, they will find ways of getting around it. Meanwhile, Ghana, Africa, small countries, it affects the rainfall patterns. And then we get into trouble. Now, one of the adverse effects of climate change, as I've said, it affects our forests. But we are also part to contribute. We have contributed to this. In fact, the figures show that the forest cover of Ghana, let's say in the 1910, 1920, the cover that we had over Ghana, we've lost more than 60% of the forest cover. And you know, forests make a contribution. The emission of carbon dioxide is in a way controlled by forests. It is the forests that use the carbon dioxide. And I'm taking you back to your elementary school classes. The carbon dioxide that is emitted by vehicles is also absorbed by the trees through the photosynthesis process. So the forests are very crucial for keeping the climate at manageable levels. In fact, at the moment, across the globe, there are 2 or 3 major forests. One is the Amazon. The second one is the Congo Basin. And then some also in Indonesia. And then, of course, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and some of our countries also keep the cover. But we have depleted our forest resources. We've cut the timber indiscriminately. I don't know how you feel. Each time I travel, maybe from Accra, Kumasi coming, or I go on the Kwao Mountains and I'm coming back, and you see the trucks loaded with bags of charcoal. And these are trees we've cut to burn the wood for charcoal. And we are still doing it. And without the trees, the rainfall pattern is affected. And you see, as we cut the trees and the weather gets drier and drier, the savanna moves down to a certain point where you will possibly find that parts of Bronga coming into Ashanti are going to lose a lot of their forest cover. At the moment, you may have read that there is a lot of discussion about the Atiwa forest, where we have got bauxite deposits. But the forest is also very important for us. Ghana needs money, so it has to exploit its natural resources. But at the same time, we ought to preserve the forests, not only for us, but for our future generation. So here we have a dilemma, and you get this very often in climate change issues, where the government has to make a decision. But what environmentalists always say is that it should be exploited sustainably. Whatever this word sustainable means, but it has to be exploited sustainably. Some years back, when I was studying environmental law in a university in the US, one of the cases that we studied was that they was going to construct a major highway across a certain area, wetlands, and there were lots of frogs, a species of frogs in that area. So the argument was this: if you construct this highway, you are going to interfere with those species of frogs that live in that area. So the environmentalists said, no way, you have to find somewhere else to put the road. So you see, these things happen between those who want to protect the environment for good reason and also for development processes. And so the forests, absolutely crucial. As a matter of fact, if we continue to exploit the forests at the rate at which we are doing, rainfall patterns will get worse. So it is important that governments protect the forests. But you say, what will they do? What will they ban charcoal? What will we replace charcoal with? Well, there have been ways where countries have exploited their forest resources sustainably. And that is, you cut, you plant. You cut and you plant. And for some countries, some years back, I also studied that in Zimbabwe, where they have got a lot of tobacco. One of their big export things is tobacco. Zimbabwe, Malawi, and some of these countries. And the farmers will cut down the trees to smoke the tobacco. I don't know whether you know how it is processed, but it's dried, it is smoked, and then it becomes dry before they can send it to the tobacco factories for them to manufacture cigarette and so on. But for them, it's a big export. In fact, recently, a few months ago, I read about the new president of Malawi, Lazarus Chikewa. And he's a Christian. He was a pastor, I think, of the Assemblies of God Church. And he was speaking to his people and said, we should be seeking the face of God to diversify our economy from producing tobacco that is not good for health, so we can shift on to something else. I hope you will pray with him that God will give him wisdom. But the way we've been exploiting our resources, the government has introduced, I think, some measures about tree planting. As usual, we are not very serious with it. What is the use of planting a tree if you don't take care of it? If you don't water it? If you don't protect the goats from coming to eat it? So, I mean, it has to be done in a sustainable manner to protect the trees that are planted. So, my dear brothers and sisters, protecting our forests is also a critical thing. Tomorrow, we'll be looking at how the church can make a contribution to protecting the environment. What can the church do in its own small way? I'm not talking about mega projects, but in the area where you are, the town, the village, in your neighborhood, what can the church do? And there is something that you can do. The Bible says, let none idly hear you say that there is nothing I can do. So a little initiative by the church will make a contribution. So protecting our forests, water resources. One, again, for some of you who come from the villages, when we were kids, there were rivers or streams that we had to cross to go to the farm or to even to travel to the next villages. What has happened? A lot of those streams are there no more. Go there, and the streams have either dried up or something has happened, and they are not there. So the water resources where you and I would carry the bucket and go and fetch water, go and see whether that river or stream is still there. And it's because, one, we've cut the trees, and you know that along rivers, there will always be trees that provide shade, so that when the sun's rays comes down, it doesn't go to get the water evaporated seriously. So the trees at the banks of the rivers offered a protection, but now we've cut them all. So the sun hits direct, and then there is evaporation. And so we have to find somebody to come and dig a borehole for us, so we can get water from under the ground. It's good. But we used to drink water from those streams. There were no pipes or anything, and they were clean. But not today. So one is how we have exposed the streams and rivers to the sun, to the extent that they are exposed and then they dry. But not only that, I'm sure you're waiting for me to touch on the big one, Galamsey. And it's serious. It is extremely serious. If you look at the pictures on TV, and nobody is saying that we cannot exploit our mineral resources. There are small-scale miners who can be taught to exploit it sustainably. But this indiscriminate way of doing it, and at the end of the day, the chemicals they use, the mercury, in processing the gold, and then pouring it into the water bodies, I don't think anybody can say that we are doing the right thing. And it's happening every day. And again, tomorrow, we'll look at how the church can do it. It comes from a conversion of the heart. Those who are doing such things, destroying God's creation, and not only God's creation, but our own lives, so that they will come to repentance and see that they are destroying God's wonderful creation. Well, you and I know that when it comes to money, people will do anything. If we are killing our siblings and friends for money, 18-year-olds killing their friends to become rich so they can buy a car. And for the water bodies, we don't care. And it's sad when you look at some of the bodies of rivers, the Pearl River and some others. And it's not as if nobody sees what is happening. But the little money that they will get will make them close their eyes to it. But I think we as Christians also need to talk about this. So it's not only illegal mining, it also comes from the cutting down of trees along river banks, because those trees serve a certain purpose. So I think I read sometime that Ghana, if we don't take care, some years coming, we might be importing what? Wood from some countries. And the rate at which we are going, if we don't protect our water bodies, there's going to be problems, because the United Nations has said that in the coming years, one area of conflict is going to be water. There's going to be so much conflict about water. And for those who have been reading the news, the Nile is becoming a major source of conflict. The Nile has its source, I think, from DRC in the forests. But then when it goes all the way, it gets to Ethiopia, Sudan. Then Ethiopia says, Egypt says that Egypt is the Nile and the Nile is Egypt. And so currently there is an undercurrent about the Nile, because Ethiopia has built a major dam, and that dam is providing them with power. And Egypt says, you are blocking the water from getting to me. So we don't know what is going to happen. They keep talking. And Ethiopia has started generating power from the Nile. But it could be a source of conflict. As a matter of fact, Ghana, we are also facing a similar situation with a white voter. I think I read something in the papers, I think 2-3 days ago, where Burkina is opening the dam. And when they open it, the water comes, destroys the farms, and drives away people from their homes. What do? Burkina needs power. So they want, and the river flows through their land. So they want to make use of it. Maybe we could also think of making use of all this water that comes for purposes of irrigation. But I don't know. I don't want to get into the politics of that. So water resources, it could be a major source of conflict, but we are polluting it. And these are not the major causes. There are places where also people are throwing rubbish into the rivers that provide them with water to drink. Some even go to toilet along the river banks. And when it rains, it washes into the water and pollutes it. Okay, let me go on to sanitation and waste disposal. You will see I've referred in my notes to a verse in the book of Leviticus. And I found this very interesting when I first discovered it. That God gave the people of Israel specific instructions on how to dispose human waste. God said, Deuteronomy 23:12-14, designate a place outside the camp where you can go to relieve yourself. As part of your equipment, have something to dig with. And when you relieve yourself, dig a hole and cover up your excrement. For the Lord your God moves about in your camp to protect you and to deliver you from your enemies. Your camp must be holy, so that he will not see among you anything indecent and turn away from you. God's command to the people of Israel. They didn't have flush toilets. They didn't have KVIPs. They didn't even have the atomgo. But people will go into the bush, which is still happening, and relieve themselves. God says, look, I'm a holy God. I come to you. Emmanuel, God with us. So God said, when you go to relieve yourself in the bush, and you see, these people were traveling from Egypt to the land of Canaan. They didn't have time to build toilets. God knew that they were going to need to relieve themselves. But he says, do it in a manner. God did not say it will smell. God did not say you will walk in it. But he said, I will come amongst you. So sanitation, a healthy and sound environment is biblical. But what do we find? Indiscriminate disposal, not only of human waste, but the household waste. And I think over the weekend I was reading in one of the papers, the Accra business district, and the amount of garbage that piles up there. The women were complaining that government come and take it, but who puts it there in the first place? And so sanitation has become a problem. Zoom Lion cannot solve it alone. But you see also in some countries, they are making money out of the waste. They process the waste to generate energy. So the waste, but it takes a lot of effort. I don't know whether if they introduce that in Ghana, we'll do it. The Ghanaians, we don't want to obey laws. But what happens is that we lived in Germany when I worked for the Climate Change Secretariat. And you have to separate your household waste. They give you about 2 or 3 bins. So you know where to put plastic. You know where to put waste food items. And you need to know where to put other wastes. And then they've got places, I don't know whether they are building one in Accra or Kumasi, but where waste is processed for energy. And some places for fertilizer. Again, at one time, the house in which I lived, the compound, we had a tree. The tree grew so big and became so dangerous. So we had to get somebody to come and cut the tree. After cutting the tree and the leaves and everything, we had to get a vehicle to come and collect it, bigger than Abubuya. And so they collected it. But you know, they had created a place in a cemetery nearby. So each time you prune your trees, you go and put the trees, the prune branches and so on there. And then they will come for it and use it, grind it, whatever. At the end of the day, use it for fertilizer. So if you go to the shop and you need fertilizer for your garden, it could be possibly be coming from trees that have been grinded, and it's natural. It's not chemical. So there are ways that some of these things could be used. Waste disposal. What can we do? Godliness, cleanliness, they go hand in hand. But sometimes we don't attend to it. But what has actually made our situation worse is plastics. Plastics have become a major waste element. Go to demonstration, not too far from here, or to any of our markets. If you want to buy cassava, it will go into one plastic bag. Tomatoes, another plastic bag. Garden eggs, another plastic bag. At the end of the day, by the time you leave the market, you've got a pile of plastic, black ones mainly. Again, how do we dispose of those plastics? At the end of the day, they find themselves, the plastic finds its way into the gutter. And then it blocks the gutter. And then when it rains, the rain has to find its way somewhere. But it's been blocked by the plastic. But other countries are trying. Go to Kenya. When you go to the supermarket to buy anything, you won't get a plastic bag. They use paper. And paper is biodegradable. So you throw the paper, you can throw it anywhere. At the end of the day, when it rains and gets wet, it will get rotten. I attended a meeting in Rwanda. You hear a lot about Rwanda these days. Before I got there, they told us plastics are not allowed. And so right at the airport, if you have a plastic bag, you have to find a way of leaving it there because it's an offense. You think this will work in Ghana? But plastic is doing a lot of harm to this country. And we will have to find a way of dealing with this plastic that is all over the way. Tomorrow I will share with you a little experience, a little project that I initiated in my church. But we're not able to sustain it. But maybe you can do it. It is doable. So we'll look at it tomorrow. So plastic bags, serious issues. I've touched on only a few of these challenges that we face environmentally. And we are stewards of what God has created. We have a role to play to protect God's beautiful creation. And frankly, it is good. It is really good when you look at maybe a full-fledged forest that is green than when it is cut and there are no trees there. Where do you get shade? And so we need to do the best that we can as believers to enhance the beauty of what God has created. The Bible says the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So long as it belongs to God, the believer has an obligation. He has a mandate from God to protect what God has created. And we enhance it for our own benefits and also for the benefit of the future generation. So Emmanuel, I think I will end here. And maybe if we have a question. But what I intend to do, and if it's possible at all, to divide ourselves into groups. So if we get about 10, 12 in a group, so that we can look at these specific issues that I have touched on. Climate change, forestation, deforestation, water resources, and sanitation. There are many others that we could think about, so that we ourselves can look at these issues and see what can we do about them. So I leave that to you so that at least we can have, well, we can do it tomorrow. So maybe after or before I deal with what the church can do, maybe it's, I don't know whether it's before or after, so that we can also solicit your ideas because I think you have ideas to share as to how we can address some of these things. Thank you. I'll stop here. Maybe if there are any questions on the major challenges, but climate change is devastating. If you've seen the pictures about what is happening in Pakistan, your heart will break for you, but it's not so far. I think there's one in the papers. Is it Chiriponi or somewhere? Where we've also got floods and they have washed away the bridges. And so crossing from one side to the other is also a problem. Because the rains came too much. So government has to find money to build a bridge. And it has to come from somewhere. So it has to be diverted so that we can solve some of these problems. Thank you.